Okay, I think we're about ready to go ahead and get started again for the last session of the day. So if y'all want to get your bag of pretzels and peanuts and come on back in, we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is session 4, aligning retail pricing with grid needs. This is the first time that we've really addressed this topic in any detail here at ESIG, and I think we've got a really good panel that Debbie and Carl put together here this afternoon. So I'm certainly looking forward to what the speakers have to say and to learning a little bit myself. And I'd like to introduce Carl Linvill from the Regulatory Assistance Project, who's going to be chairing the session. So Carl.
Thank you, Charlie. Hello, everyone. Like Charlie said, we have actually 5 great speakers for you on the topic of retail pricing and grid needs. Grid needs is one of those terms that if you ask the question, you know, what's on your mind, or what are you concerned about with response to the needs on the grid? The answer you get depends on the seat that the person is sitting in. So I think in this audience, mostly, we talk about bulk electric systems. And so probably the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about retail pricing and grid needs is how retail pricing is making my job on the bulk electric system harder. But there are also grid needs on the distribution systems. And of course, regulators, utility regulators, are primarily concerned with making sure that pricing addresses and mitigates grid needs on the distribution system. So the holy grail would be retail pricing that creates highest value uses of resources from the distribution system, while not, creating unpalatable grid needs in any domain. But that's the holy grail. It doesn't exist. And today we're going to get 4 different perspectives on a pricing solution or a pricing approach to making pricing better aligned with meeting grid needs. So to kick things off, we have Debbie, who's going to, as a part of this task force came together early last year. We had our first meeting together as a task force in March, and the task force has met every month since then. 7 papers have been commissioned. 4 of the papers are being presented to you today. So Debbie's going to start by giving an overview of what's gone on in the task force and some takeaways from each of the papers, and and then a few takeaways so far from her perspective on the project overall. So Debbie, come on up and get mic'd up. And I will turn my mic off.
Okay, can you hear me? Does it work? Oh, great. Okay, thanks so much, Carl. Thanks to all of you. I know it's late in the day. So about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago when I was at GE, we were doing one of these value of solar studies, where you kind of stack value streams of solar for Colorado Springs utilities. And we were looking at rate designs for Colorado Springs utilities because they were going to get more solar on their system. And one of the things we looked at for them was time of use rates. And when we were looking at time of use rates, and I realized how this was affecting their demand, it occurred to me to just do a value of time of use rates study. And so just on the side, just for fun, we did a kind of little value stack of what a time of use rate did for them in terms of bringing them value on their system. And it brought a ton of value. It actually brought a ton of value similar to the amount of value that the solar was bringing on their system. And I remember thinking it was like one of those aha moments that time of use rates acted like storage on the system, and that rates they could act like a resource on the system, right? You could have a peak time rebate act like a gas peaker, and that you could do a lot of things with prices to act like resources. Anyway, I'd been lobbying ever since then for us to be doing something more in this space to bring together the pricing people and the grid needs people together, because there's so much that we can do on the pricing side to help with grid needs. So whether we're talking about resource adequacy or system balancing, we're talking about supply and demand, right? And balancing supply and demand. And almost all of the time, we're talking about just half of the equation. We're just talking about the supply side, and we're leaving out the other half, which is the demand. Now, there's two big ways we can get flexibility from demand. We got prices and we got programs. We're going to focus today on the pricing piece, but obviously there's an interplay with DER programs, demand response programs, energy efficiency programs, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I want to start with asking, who's on a time of use rate here, or a time varying rate of some kind? Okay, and for those of you who raised their hands, if you're from California, put your hand down. And who is on a time of use rate or a time varying rate not from California? Okay, so there are a few of you. That's really interesting. So one of the things we know is that there's 100 million customers in the US with smart meters. But until the recent default time of use rates in California, there were very few customers that were actually using those smart meters for something useful and being on time varying rates. And we also know we're going to need more than time of use rates, right? In the future, we're going to need to move to something that's more dynamic to really get dynamic flexibility from demand. Now, the time is now to really do something. So, you know, wind and solar makes resource adequacy, system balancing more challenging. But we've got today enabling technologies for control and communications, relatively low cost. Probably, I don't know, how many people have like Nest or the Ecobee or some kind of, you know, smart thermostat? Yeah, lots of folks. And then we know that electrification is a double-edged sword, right? If we don't manage it, it could create lots of problems on the grid. If we do manage it, it can really help the grid. So managing this is going to be really important. So as Carl said, we started this task force at the beginning of the year. We got wide participation, lots of different types of folks together, because you're really trying to get at this intersection of the grid people, which a lot of you are, but also the rate making people, and then also the customer perspective, which is essential in all of this. And we had a whole bunch of these kind of educational level setting sessions. So I don't know if you guys have seen this magazine that Ryan's got out on the front table, but it's the July-August version of the IEEE magazine. And as an example, Sanem Sergici from Brattle wrote an article in here on retail rate design for, this is all based on 100% clean energy. And Arne's also got an article in here on resource adequacy. And anyway, Sanem's got an article in here talking about retail rate design for 100%. We looked at, you know, what's a framework for designing retail rates and programs to meet grid needs. And we got, as Carl pointed out, 7 folks in the task force to write white papers. And I don't have enough time to go into each of these, and we're going to get 4 of these authors to speak today. But we've got Travis Kavulla of NRG, Dick O'Neill of DOE, Mike Hogan of RAP, Arne Olson and the E3 team, Jenny Chen of WRI, Sanem Sergici and the Brattle team, and then Tom Hines of APS, talking about different aspects of rate design and how it can be used to better help the grid. And we'll probably have these papers finalized in the next month or two. We'll probably do some webinars so that you'll be able to hear the papers in detail, since we're going to cover 4 today, but there'll be 3 more that we won't be covering today. I just wanted to mention some key points from the white papers, and these are sort of, you know, key points as they are today. Things are still being finalized. One big key point is, if we want demand flexibility, we really got to expose the relevant entities to price signals. And it's not just energy price signals that we need to expose them to. It's also transmission, it's distribution, it's capacity price signals. You're all probably aware of, you know, in Texas, the 4 coincident peak way that they use to allocate transmission charges for the following year is based on your peak usage during the peak period in June and July and August, September. And as a result of how they allocate that transmission charge, you can get 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of demand voluntarily reducing on their own accord because they're trying to avoid those transmission charges. So there's huge things that we can see in the marketplace when you do expose customers or the load serving entities to the price signals. We also see as another key point time varying rates moving to default, so opt out for all customers, like what's happening in California. There's an intersection between pricing and programs. Tom Hines especially talks about this in his white paper, and if you carefully orchestrate what you do with pricing and on the DER program side, you can get a lot of cost and emission savings and really help with stress events. Price response is not just about rate design and enabling technology. Those are really important, but it's also about end use capabilities and what the end use technologies have. For example, an energy efficient home can provide more load shifting capability than a leaky home. Bidding and demand, this solves a huge number of problems with things like monitoring and verification and baselining of demand response. Dick O'Neill talks a lot about this, and not only the problems it can solve, but some good places to start. For those of you who aren't aware, markets are already set up for demand to be bid in terms of a cost curve, and it's that inflexible vertical demand curve that is bid in that really creates that lack of flexibility. Alternative cost-based rates can help with electrification without increasing overall bills. So Sanem's going to talk about this a bunch in her talk, that electrification is one of the big things we're trying to encourage. But if it's just going to drive people's bills up because maybe they're in the Northeast and they're paying 40 cents a kilowatt hour and they put in the heat pump and now their bills are going to go up, there are ways we can use alternate rate design so that they can still electrify and get those carbon benefits, but without driving up their bills. Options for 3-part rates that Arne's going to talk about, including ways to look at fixed charges that aren't regressive, and then how we do EV charging and how we think about EV charging, not just in terms of citing them for transportation needs, but also for grid prices and grid locations. So those are some of the things that our white papers discuss. We're really looking forward to today's discussion and all of your feedback, especially as we finalize these and get them published. Thanks.
Next, we have for the with the commitment award, Travis Kavulla coming to us from the maternity ward in a hospital near him, where twins were recently born to his family. And Travis will be delivering his presentation from there. Do we have Travis?
Yeah. Hey, Carl, how you doing?
Hi.
Let me, it's great to be with you with these 72-hour-old twin babies, obviously accelerating their lifespan at a rapid pace here. Sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm sure you all understand. And at the very least, the well wishes of our friends and family have given me some Zoom decorations that I can place strategically behind me during this talk. So apologies if I get interrupted, but here goes. And let me start my slide deck here. So first, here you go, obligatory photo of the kids. Say welcome to the world to Clara and Alice. As I said, they were born just over 72 hours ago, and we're happy to welcome them. I hope they give their mom and I and their big brother Julius an easy time of things. But getting into the presentation, I've written a paper for ESIG called "Why is the Smart Grid So Dumb?" And it really gets to the core of what Debbie is talking about. We've made these monumental investments in trying to modernize the grid and to be able to sort of automate and visualize demand on a fairly granular level. And those measurements are being taken by load serving entities and electric distribution companies really all over the United States at this point. It's about 124 million smart meters that have been installed. If you look at the Form 861 and the US DOE estimates, we're going to reach a point of near ubiquity by the end of the decade with 93% penetration of smart meters for all customer classes across the United States. So this landscape, which has come at a very high price to consumers, essentially eliminates the hardware difficulty of being able to activate demand response and demand generally. Of course, software challenges remain, the issues in the back office of utilities, the market design, the monopolization of many retail markets, things I get into in my paper, in addition to the fundamental regulatory challenges, all remain barriers to this. But it really does raise the question, when so many billions of dollars have been spent on the smart grid, why are the rates not as smart as the grid itself? And this is interesting because when smart meter investment began to happen with real dispatch about a decade ago, it was foretold, indeed promised in certain state laws, that smart rates would come hand in hand with smart meters. You have my former colleague from the Pennsylvania Commission, the later FERC Commissioner, Rob Powelson, who said, to be frank, it is pointless to have smart meters if you're still going to have dumb rates. You had a number of state laws, including in Pennsylvania, which has seen ubiquitous smart meter deployment, making smart meter deployment contingent on the rollout of, and this is crucial, opt-in or voluntary time of use rates. And then you had a consistent rollout into utilities rate base of this smart metering equipment. So to just give a case study that I present in my report, First Energy has 4 operating companies in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They deployed as of a few years ago 2 million advanced meters, but at the highest point, literally only 94 customers, that's not missing a digit, not missing a zero, have opted in to that time of use rate design, and that's equivalent to an enrollment rate of 0.005%. I'm not a math guy, but I was smart enough to be able to present these pie charts to you at the bottom of the slide, showing smart versus dumb meters, and then the flat versus time varying rates. As you can see, they're basically the inverse of one another. And yet, as I think we all realize, even if there had not been 10 years ago, there's certainly a growing need for demand flexibility. This is an ESIG seminar, so this will not be the first, this might be the first, but not the last time you see the duck curve. My spin on it is that the duck curve has come to be, and that its belly is in fact sort of distending downwards to a lower and lower minimum net load during any given hour. And that just tells you how relatively abundant energy can be relative to demand, and then also possible moments of scarcity as the sun begins to set without commensurate sort of dispatchability or capacity investments. And then at the same time, in the lower right-hand corner, maybe a graph that you've seen less frequently, but that is the cumulative annual renewable curtailment during any given year in the California ISO, and you'll see that it's just growing gangbusters year over year. I've used the latest data available for 2022 in August, as of August, but there's every reason to expect that you'll see more and more curtailment of renewables, given the size of renewable investments there and how they outstrip commensurate storage investments. So again, a lot of role for demand to be sopping up that abundant energy during times when it would otherwise be curtailed. Not just a California thing. This is ERCOT. This is the, I guess you could say this is the grain that is feeding the belly of the duck in California, and ERCOT likewise. This is ERCOT solar production during certain hours of this summer, during July in particular. And you can see, the kind of a classic pattern of solar production, where you have a single curve or single bell kind of ascending upward during the middle of the day and descending down at the same time. And in ERCOT and in California, we've seen this create a consistent pattern of pricing where, day in, day out, an abundance of renewables has an effect on midday pricing. And then we also see inflections of that same typical pattern. So in ERCOT, we've seen a great deal this summer of codependency between ERCOT scarcity pricing and underproduction or production of renewables lower than forecast. You can see that gray bar there, the green bar is July 13th, which represented some of the peak prices in ERCOT over the summer. And even though demand that day was basically the same as July 11th, you saw on peak spot prices that were about 12 times as large because of slight solar underproduction. So in other words, you see things that would seem to justify or make you seem to want retail prices that both reflected typical incidences of on-peak, off-peak to reflect the general trend, and then also some kind of critical peak feature that represents particular scarcity events. What are they saying about demand flexibility? Well, everyone increasingly seems to concede that it is more needed. And interestingly, I have not often seen RTOs speak about retail market design, something that is not in their bailiwick, something that is not within FERC's jurisdiction, something that's within the exclusive jurisdiction of state regulatory commissions. But PJM identified it, for example, as one of their 5 critical issues to get right in terms of policy, in terms of decarbonizing the grid going forward. And here they're talking about specifically not demand jerry-rigged in as a source of offered supply into their markets, but retail rate design that can kind of comprehensively and systematically signal to demand relative abundance and scarcity on their system. And they had some really interesting modeling about the relative capacity value of solar in relation to when demand was flexible and when it was not. You have state level experimentation. Sanem took the lead on this Maryland study and with the Brattle group and the Maryland Public Service Commission staff that both demonstrated a significant degree of demand flexibility, as well as a relative fighting to par between disadvantaged or lower income customers and the typical mass market customer base. And then finally, you have studies, this last bullet point out of New York, where aggressive electrification targets are forecast to be much more expensive if you don't get demand to be flexible, responding to kind of longer run price signals associated with investments in the T&D system, as well as generation capacity that could be avoided. And so here you see a forecast where $27 billion is expected to have to be spent on its sort of base case scenario, which assumes some kind of demand responsiveness in retail rate design, but it becomes $14 billion higher if you have quote unquote unmanaged electrification, where those retail price signals remain flat and demand otherwise does not respond. So the upshot of all of this is that only a handful of jurisdictions to date in North America have made time varying rates the default. And those are Ontario, California, Michigan, Colorado, and Missouri. And some of these states have not done so for each and every single utility within their jurisdiction. But I give those as examples of states where default is the policy for at least one major utility in any given state. But you're still hovering, as Debbie, I think, alluded to, at a rate of enrollment of really just single-digit percentages, even including California, for the mass market customer base in time of use rates across the entire North American continent, which is a pretty paltry state of affairs when you consider the amount of rate-based investment that's been made. So turning now to some considerations I have for policy recommendations, which are really at the heart of the paper I've written. I think it's important to recognize there are at least two, but two very distinct different regulatory models for retail supply service in the United States. One is a cost of service regulated default supplier or monopoly business model, and the other is a competitive retailer. And over the past several decades, the cost of service model has evolved to a place where utilities essentially collect all of their costs on fuel and purchase power. And so they do not have a strong incentive to essentially avoid the costs of serving demand on the margin. And you also have, of course, famously, a sort of perverse incentive, which is that to the extent that utility investments are justified by serving peak demand, and those utility investments are the sort of engine of growth for earnings of a utility, because of the return on rate-based model of regulation that everywhere is present in the United States for investor-owned utilities, you cannot really expect utilities to have a strong incentive themselves to activate demand. Maybe they will, because they're subject to robust integrated resource planning requirements. Maybe they will, because of, peculiar executive leadership that is not necessarily responding directly to the strongest financial incentives presented to them. Maybe they will for all sorts of other reasons. But in general, utilities have no particular reason to make this a top priority because unlike the adoption of smart meters, which are capital investments, the adoption of time of use or time varying rates that make use of those smart meters and operationalize them efficiently is not a profit center, and indeed may be earnings destructive to investor-owned utilities. And so this paper sort of posits as a theory, accepting that style of regulation is candidly unlikely to change, that it is necessary instead to push down those price signals more directly to customers through time varying retail rates. Secondly, an alternative model to this is a model of competitive retailers who, unlike regulated utilities, do not have a captive consumer base and are not able to surcharge their customers for past costs that they have incurred, which then extant rates might not have sufficiently recovered. Instead, those retailers tend to have a contractual obligation to serve a retail customer at a particular price, or even if it is a time varying price structure that's known in advance. And consequently, there is at least alignment of incentives around a reduction in costs to supply demand on the part of the retailer and the customer itself, which shares that interest. And those savings can be shared back with the customer. They can be used to lower the cost of future rate offers. In any case, it informs necessarily the pricing decisions that competitive retailers engage with as it relates to energy supply. But there's a big asterisk here, which Debbie has already alluded to, which is that T&D costs, as well as generation capacity in certain markets, those costs are often a pass-through directly to the consumer, and they have no intermediation on the part of the retailer itself. And when that occurs, you end up making someone we call a retailer not actually responsible for the full retail bill, and it ends up devaluing any kind of demand activation programs that the retailer might offer, or its incentive to offer time of use rates that might squeeze demand-related reductions in those cost categories out of their consumer base. So problems in both houses, but the houses are very, very different in terms of the incentives they face. So the two sort of poles of the kind of retail rate structure that you could adopt were definitely heavily weighted on this one side, which is the flat rates, just cents for the mass market customers anyways, just a simple customer charge and then a cents per kilowatt hour fee that's assessed to customers that, again, over 90% of mass market, which is residential and small commercial customers, make use of today. And then on the other side, you have sort of this, in some sense, theoretical ideal that there should be almost no intermediation between the wholesale and retail market, and that you should be trying to push down on a highly dynamic basis toward real-time pricing prices to retail consumers that reflect wholesale conditions of margin. I tend to express opposition to the former and caution toward the latter, mainly due to the extraordinary unpopularity of gritty-like business models when things go wrong. Things did go wrong during Winter Storm Uri, and that entire business model has been outlawed in the most robust retail market in the United States, Texas. And so I don't think we can expect it to take hold very many places in the United States. And to the degree it does, it's just one bad event away from being outlawed and then probably dooming this whole experiment in time varying rates. So instead, I counsel sort of a middle ground, which is a combination of tiered time of use rates as well as critical peak pricing, again, related to the trends that we saw earlier. Or alternatively, in these competitive retail markets, I think you do see an emergence of products that give inducements for demand flexibility, even if they might be characterized by flat rates or entirely flat bills like subscription rates, but on which flexible demand inducements can be added on top. My paper makes 4 reforms that I'll go through briefly, and then I'll end for the day and welcome a discussion after we all present. The first for regulated utilities. Again, utilities exposure really is consumers exposure because they don't have an incentive financially. This is no pejorative against them. They simply don't have this incentive to reduce the cost of serving demand, and someone somewhere has to have a consistent and price-based incentive to flex demand. And that needs to be customers themselves if their intermediary retailer does not have that incentive. So I'm of a mind that that time varying rate should be opt-out or the default option in places that do have cost of service regulated default suppliers or monopolies. Again, I give some descriptions of those places here. Second, for competitive retailers who do have more of an incentive to reduce the cost of energy supply to the demand they serve, they nevertheless don't have that incentive as it relates to transmission, distribution, and certain capacity costs in most markets in the United States. And ideally, they would have that incentive directly facing them, and they would be able to intermediate it. A corollary to this, and this is reform number 3, is to make sure that state level regulation has actually facilitated a direct relationship between these retailers and customers. Right now, in most jurisdictions, these retailers have to bill through someone else's bill, the incumbent monopoly utility, rather than their own bill. And you can imagine the lack of innovation, just to use a comparison example in the telecommunications space, if every bill you receive from every internet service provider or every app maker or every phone company came through AT&T. Which is essentially what still happens in the electricity space. I'm not going to walk through this because Debbie did a good job explaining the sort of financial stakes of not facing retailers with all relevant costs. There's simply a big piece of the pie that they cannot monetize for the activation of demand. And this is an ERCOT example, which even in the presence of very high energy supply costs, which may reach ERCOT's peak price of $5,000 a megawatt hour, that amount of money still pales in comparison to the 4 CP avoided costs associated with transmission. So to just put it simply, looking toward the bottom 2 pie charts, the most amount of money a retailer to mass market customers could hope to save out of the 4 hours of avoided energy during ERCOT's summer peaks is about $20. Whereas if you add in avoided transmission costs, it suddenly becomes more than $70 for that season. And that, as you can imagine, has a big correlation to the willingness of competitive retailers to make investments in things like smart thermostats or other assets that are necessary to activate demand. And then finally, it's important to say that automated devices are sometimes useful, if not necessary, to take advantage of time varying rates. I myself actually don't have a huge number of automated devices in my home, and I nevertheless am able to take advantage of time varying rates because I simply defer my major appliances to run during certain times. But of course, it's much more helpful, and it sort of is necessary if you're going to go to fully dynamic retail rates. To have a proliferation of automated devices, which is something that becomes easier if you're making standards around them to make them smart by default, or to have other regulatory programs that have traditionally been used to subsidize round-the-clock energy efficiency, instead targeting toward this activation of demand at peak. So on a concluding thought, it's important, I think, to actually have a robust two-sided market where demand acts as demand in response to retail offers, and where there's a proliferation of a retail marketplace that is vibrant. Our status quo in this field has been, again, to jerry-rig demand response as some kind of sort of proxy supply offer into the wholesale markets. That's workable. I think it's second best, but it would be much better, and I think ultimately more consumer friendly, to instead have a kind of robust and clear retail price signal that tells consumers themselves what they can do in order to participate in this modern electricity economy. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for having me.
And now next, we have Arne Olson. Arne leads E3's bulk energy infrastructure practice. Arne helps clients navigate changes to bulk electric system operations and investment needs brought about by increasing policy and market interest in clean and renewable energy production. He's led a number of landmark studies of the feasibility, cost, and reliability implications of achieving deep decarbonization and high renewable penetration goals for electric utilities, including studies of 100% renewables in California, the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, New England, and PJM. Arne, take it away.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Carl. That's a bit of a tough act to follow, but that's okay. First, I wanted to say thanks to you and to Debbie and to Charlie for the opportunity to participate in the panel and the task force and to develop this paper. So our paper is really focused on this concept of grid needs, aligning the retail rates with the needs of grid. And what that really means is, what are we focusing on? What we want the customers to do? Like, what kind of response do we want from the customers? And if we can get them to respond in the right way, then they'll be able to save both money and emissions. So they'll save costs and they'll create societal benefits. So the question is, in what ways do we want them to respond? What is the desirable response that we want from customers going forward? And I'm going to do a little just transposition of where we've been in the past with respect to avoided costs and where we're going in the future. And here, I have then and now kind of in quotes. You can think of then as the mythical past, and now as maybe the impending future. But I think you get the idea of, in a sense, our needs are changing, and as a result, our rate designs, the response that we want from customers is changing as well, and therefore our rates, we want them to respond to rates, also need to change. So in the mythical past, fuel was expensive. When Art Rosenfeld and the California Energy Commission really helped to create the energy efficiency industry, it was in response to very high fuel prices, which we incurred really around the clock all the time. Fuel was expensive, power was dirty. And so conservation was what we wanted the customers to do. The response that we wanted was for customers to reduce their energy consumption really all the time, more sometimes than others, but really we wanted them to conserve and reduce all the time. And so volumetric rates are a great way to give customers that incentive. And you can think of the inclining block rate as maybe the platonic ideal rate design, because it's aligned both with environmental objectives, it's aligned with cost saving objectives, so efficiency objectives, but it's also aligned with equity objectives, and to an extent, because larger customers use more and end up paying more. We really are moving away from that time to a time when clean energy will be abundant during many hours of the year. So we're not necessarily saving fuel, every hour when we're reducing consumption. And even more, we need to induce people to use more electricity to achieve our environmental goals. Debbie talked about electrification as a key component of reducing carbon emissions in buildings and in the transportation sector. We want people to consume more electricity during some times of the year. And so what we're seeing is that high volumetric rates are now becoming a major impediment to achieving our environmental goals. And in some cases, because of the arbitrage opportunities that I'll talk about, they also are impeding our achieving of our equity goals as well. So just to dive in a little deeper to that, then reducing consumption avoided fuel combusting generation and emissions with high variable costs. So a lot of our costs were variable costs, and conserving energy, reducing consumption helped us avoid those costs almost no matter when the conservation occurred. Now, almost all of our avoidable resources have high fixed costs and very, very low variable costs. We're squeezing the variable cost out of the system. The more we reduce emissions and fuel consumption, the more we squeeze variable costs out of the system, and the more we transition to a system that's almost entirely fixed costs that we incurred in the past, and now have to figure out how to recover over a reasonable time frame and in a reasonable way. Again, market prices and emissions might vary by time of day and year, but gas was almost always on the margin. The variations were relatively small. We're moving to a system in which some hours we're going to have surplus. We'll be curtailing solar and wind energy. Other times will become even more and more expensive to meet because we'll be starting more and more gas-fired resources. Hopefully carbon prices will be higher and higher. So it'll be more and more expensive to meet those peak demands. Not only are our avoided costs transitioning and changing, but the ways that customers can and are responding is also changing as well. So in the past, mostly what customers could do was turn off their lights, install complex fluorescent light bulbs, and more efficient appliances. In effect, conservation was the thing that they could mostly do. And that tended to be widely spread. It tended to have broadly the effect that you see on the left-hand side there of reducing consumption, not always uniformly, but largely just reducing consumption. And so that has a relatively minor impact on their load shapes and therefore on the cost to serve them. You weren't too worried that they were going to do really big things that would shift costs in large volumes onto others. But that has already changed from what you see on the right. Obviously, installing customer rooftop solar is a very different response from energy efficiency. It really creates a different net load shape that the system has to serve. It's a very different cost to service. It's a very different set of avoided costs that you see with that pattern on the right there. So we're already seeing very, very harmful arbitrage between retail rates and wholesale avoided costs. In California in particular, with the massive adoption of rooftop solar. And this is only going to get more pronounced as we have home batteries, as we have electric vehicles, and as we have all of these devices out there that can read conditions in real time and respond in much more precise ways. So these devices are coming at us. And the more that we send them dumb signals, the more that they're going to do dumb things. And if we don't send them signals to align the customer consumption with the needs of the grid, they're going to align it with their own needs at the expense of the grid and at the expense of everyone else. So that's what's coming our way, and it's coming faster than we think. Very high level, the types of responses that we need to that are beneficial, that help us avoid costs in the future are time shifting and peak shaving. Peak shaving is both for resource adequacy. It's to avoid fixed investments in generation capacity. It's also to avoid fixed investments in transmission and distribution capacity, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then it's also time shifting because we'll have during some hours more energy than we need. Now we can accomplish a lot of that through bulk grid storage or battery storage. And that's what's kind of demonstrated on the chart there is we're charging during times when we have surplus solar, we're discharging during times in the evening. But let's be honest, storage is a cost. It both costs a lot of capital to invest in a lot of grid scale storage, And there's also round trip losses. Every time you store energy in a battery and you bring it back out again, you're losing some of that energy. So it's way better, if you can, to match up the times when you want to consume the electricity directly with the times when it's being created and when it's in surplus. So what we want to think about, load flexibility is in effect taking the place of, it's avoiding costly investments in energy storage. That's mostly what it's doing. So thanks. Yeah. So the main issue I want to drive home on this chart is that the times when it's important to respond and it's important to conserve and shed load to avoid fixed costs are very specific throughout the year. It's not now a time when all hours you're saving roughly the same amount of costs. We think of generation capacity events might only occur 30 hours a year. And it's similar for transmission and distribution events. Most of the time, you're operating way below the maximum delivery capability of the network. And so most of the time, if you consume another kilowatt hour, maybe there's some fuel, maybe there's a small amount of variable cost, but you're really not doing anything to impose new fixed costs on the system. You're sizing the system to meet the maximum peak demand. The times when you really need people to conserve are when the conditions are such that aggregate demand is getting you close to whatever that fixed capacity of the system is, whether that's transmission or distribution and generation. So that's what I'm kind of illustrating there with the blue wedges that go way up. So a small number of hours of the year is when you need the response. If you're sending a signal during the other hours to consume, then you're sending a bad signal because you're encouraging people not to consume electricity during times when you might want them to meet our societal goals. You're sending a signal that discourages them from adopting electrified technologies, adopting electric cars, and adopting heat pumps. So that's the concern. And you don't get there with just a simple time of use rate, because these 30 hours a year, they don't occur every afternoon. They only occur on the hottest or the coldest days of the year. So to get this kind of really beneficial response, you need to have much more precise price signals. I'll just quickly note that the type of response that is beneficial and how you get it and how hard it is to get it depends on what type of cost you're trying to avoid. So generation, fuel, generation capacity, those are relatively avoidable. When you don't consume a kilowatt hour of electricity, you're not burning fuel in that instant. And it's easier to line up customer response with generation capacity needs as well. It gets harder when you get into transmission and distribution because the timing gets more specific and the location gets more specific. So for transmission, you might, if someone reduces their consumption upstream of the constraint, they might make it worse. So you need to have them reduce their consumption downstream of the constraint. And when you get into the distribution system, you don't have the load diversity, so it's harder and harder to send price signals the farther down at the end of the network that you get. So your focus on rate design at the top is mostly on sending efficient price signals. When you get towards the bottom of this chart, it might be more on recovering of fixed costs. And there's always a tension between those two things. So what are the general concepts of a multi-part rate? This is what's going to be in our paper. We want to send good price signals to induce beneficial response at the margin. What that means to us is energy and potentially demand charges that are based on long-run marginal cost. Send the signals based on the cost that we can avoid. Long-run marginal costs are greater than short-run marginal costs, so you get some cost recovery from that, but not enough. You still need some other mechanism to recover costs. And there you need to get into a demand-based charge or a fixed charge that really has equity as its primary goal, because you don't want the remainder of that signal of that cost recovery to send a negative signal about not consuming additional electricity. So the specific elements of that might be dynamic hourly rates that align with wholesale market prices, either a demand charge or a dynamic energy adder that's aligned with the wholesale market capacity structure, the way that you define the need for capacity. Another dynamic charge that's coincident with transmission needs. And hopefully it's not 4 CP, because that's not actually how the costs are incurred. That's not how costs are avoided. Hopefully it's more like 1 CP based on whatever the conditions are that create the need for the next transmission investment. The farther out you go on the distribution system, you might get to non-coincident demand because you're more focused on fixed cost recovery. And we're focused here on what's the smartest rate design that you can make for people with batteries, cars, Nest devices, machine readable, that are ready to arbitrage the heck out of you. That's probably not for everybody. You probably still need some kind of a legacy rate, and maybe that can be a TOU to at least send some little bit of signal to those that don't want to be prosumers. And then last thing I want to finish with is just this notion that I've heard talked about. I've heard people give presentations about the idea that fixed charges, aren't found in nature. And I just think that's wrong. And so I went through my credit card bill at the end of a month here recently to see how many fixed charges I have on my card every month that might look kind of like electricity. And I found quite a few of them. Costco, I pay them a certain amount a month to be a member. I get a discount on the groceries as a result. Amazon Prime, same thing. I get free delivery. New York Times doesn't charge me by the article. I used to have a data plan on Verizon, and that was too complicated. Now I have a fixed plan. Recology is my garbage company. They charge me by the size of the bin. So there's lots of examples out there that look just like the kind of income-based or subscription-based fixed charge that we're proposing here. So we shouldn't be afraid of a fixed charge as a neutral way, signal-free way to recover costs. So, thank you.
12-minute presentation. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carl. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Great. Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about some really exciting work that we did with a client of ours, and now with ESIG, we had the opportunity to make that work more generic and applicable, and be able to disseminate and share with the broader audience. I'm really pleased to be talking about the heat pump friendly retail rate designs, which I should note that are not subsidized, that are still cost-based. So we'll basically talk about how we design those rates and what implications that they have for heating electrification. So first of all, so in the US, building sector
Hey,
has—
Sanem, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yes.
We can hear you, but it's a little bit, is there any way for you to be a little closer to a mic?
Let me see. Let me try my earphones. Hold on a second. Is this better?
Let's give it a try.
Okay. So what I was saying is that in the US, building sector has been contributing 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. And electrification of space and water heating using heat pumps has become a major component of state and city climate action plans. So given this important element, the economics of heat pumps relative to natural gas will be an important driver of customer adoption of these technologies. So there are a few observations about heat pumps and their relative economics compared to gas furnaces and boilers. So first of all, they are still currently typically more expensive than gas furnaces and boilers. Heat pump operating costs vary by region depending on the climate, equipment efficiency, utility rates, and rate structures. And even in regions where heat pump operating costs are lower than gas costs, the gap needs to be pretty significant to offset the upfront cost premium, and so that customers have reasonable paybacks on their investment. And another development is that we're seeing some support from some stakeholders across the country for creation of heat pump specific rates to reduce operating costs and lower barriers for gas customers to electrify. Here, I want to make this distinction that when I talk about heat pump specific rates or heat pump beneficial rates, I'm not really talking about providing subsidies to a specific technology. I'm talking about cost-based rates that are more aligned with the operating characteristics of heat pumps. And these rates, when offered, will be available to heat pump customers, but they could also be selected by other residential customers as well. So the purpose of our study is to quantify the operating cost differences between heat pumps and gas heat for a generic electric and gas utility, and basically evaluate the use of alternative rate structures to reduce the heat pump operating cost gap. So we look at this gap under the default rate structure and then run that cost gap calculation through various rate designs and see how that math changes as we go through different rates. So currently the landscape is that there's a scarcity of rate options that are explicitly designed to address the operating cost gap. And there are also not many, or we haven't found any when we did the research, non-rate operating cost incentives that are available to customers. So we identified several rate design categories that may be favorable from a heat pump operating cost perspective because of the operating characteristics of heat pumps. And like I said, these rates do not have to be technology specific and they do not have to target only heat pump customers. They could be open to all customers and customers can opt in if they think they could achieve savings. So I also need to note that just because these rates are going to be available, the customers will not adopt these rates in droves. It will be equally important to address information barriers through utility programs targeting customers and pairing them with most favorable rates, contractor training programs in which contractors can be made aware about these rates, etc. Okay, so let's just dive in. So just want to share a few things about heat pump operating characteristics. First of all, heat pumps lead to higher electricity consumption. Therefore, lower volumetric rates in general favor heat pump usage. Most of the heat pump load is in the non-summer months. This should have said non-summer months. Therefore, seasonally differentiated rates in summer peaking systems might favor heat pump usage. A significant portion of the heat pump load tends to fall into the off-peak periods. So these are basically early morning hours or evening hours, late evening hours, which implies that various cost-based time of use rates might favor heat pump usage. And last but not least, heat pumps tend to have high load factors, which implies that demand-based rates might favor heat pump usage. So really important to understand those operating characteristics and how they are aligned with some of the way some of the costs are incurred in the system. So we're modeling operating cost gap under the default rate, and default rate being, you know, the rate design that's generally available in many jurisdictions for both gas and electric rates, you know, volumetric, not too many bells and whistles, and 3 alternative rate designs. For electricity, our default rate has a high volumetric rate and a low monthly customer charge. So this is a pretty prevalent rate form. Our first alternative rate, which we call rate 2 here, is a rate with low volumetric rate. So we're basically reducing the volumetric charge and we are making up for that revenue loss with increasing the customer charge. So we have a high monthly customer charge. For rate 3, we have a time varying volumetric supply, time varying volumetric delivery charge, and a low monthly customer charge. And our rate 4 is again time varying volumetric supply, time varying demand-based delivery charge, and low monthly customer charge. So these are essential elements of the alternative rates that we designed. They're all revenue neutral. We cover the same revenue from these customers. And in order to be able to come up with the operating cost gap between electric heating and gas heating, we needed to figure out the space heating, gas usage for space heating, and then turn that gas and heating need to electrical load, and then run that electric load into through different rate designs to figure out our operating cost gap. So we basically have gone through that analysis with 80 customers, 80 residential customers, and we have created 8760 electric load profiles for these customers after they installed a heat pump system. In this particular case, we model an air source heat pump system. So for our analysis, it's important to understand that you know, we look at a total customer's total energy bill. Pre-electrification, this total energy bill consists of customers' gas usage for other uses like water heating and cooking. The customer has gas bill for heating needs and also the electric bill, right? So this is customer's total energy bill before electrification. So after electrification, we still have customers' gas usage for other end users. And you will see that this gas bill, is increased over here because sometimes when customers move from gas for space heating to electric heating, that they have a different gas rate structure. So they kind of, their gas bill increases by the virtue of being subject to another gas rate. But their gas bill for heating is entirely substituted by an electric bill for heating here. And also they still have their electric bill for other users, but now that they might be subject to another electric rate schedule, that they may have some differences in their electric bill. So post-electrification, so this is how things change around. But for the purpose of our analysis, we really care about the heating operating cost gap. So we want to review the delta between the box 2, which is customers' electric bill for heating, and box 1, which is customers' gas bill for heating. So the delta between the two, 2 minus 1, is what we call a heating operating cost gap. And we want this cost gap to be negative for heat pumps to be more favorable from an adoption perspective. So we'll see how this heating cost gap will change when we run it through different rate designs. So here are some assumptions about our fuel efficiency for a gas system. It's 80% efficiency is what we assumed. We assumed a COP of around 3 for air source heat pumps. And I listed ground source heat pumps and water heating heat pumps here as well, but they're not covered in this presentation here. So we have a relationship between outsourced temperature and COP that we integrate in our analysis. So by using a 3-parameter change point linear model, we estimate customers' gas usage for heating. So what we have is for these 80 customers, their overall natural gas usage. What we do is through this regression model, we isolate the gas usage for heating purposes. So in this chart, the orange section of the chart is what we isolate as gas usage for space heating. And we basically do that for every single customer in our sample. We run that regression for every customer, and we isolate each of these 80 customers' heating related gas usage. So now that we have this heating related gas usage.
And I'm about 2 minutes, okay?
Okay. So now that we have this gas usage, we then convert it into an electric load through some conversions. And then we run them through our rate design. So this is our gas rate design default. And we also have our electric rate designs, which I'm not really go through the details, but rest assured all the rates are revenue neutral. They recover the same revenues. And as I mentioned, they have rate 3 is a time of use energy rate, rate 4 is a time of use demand rate, and rate 2 has a higher fixed charge and lower volumetric rates. So what we end up seeing is that replacing gas space heating with an air source heat pump on the default electric rate, I'm here on rate 1, increases the total energy bill by about $233. But when we switch to any of the 3 alternative rates, we see that annual total energy bill goes down by about $220 to $980 based on the alternative rate structure that we talk about. So this is quite an improvement on the total energy bill. And if you look at the distribution of the bill changes, again, on the total energy bill, out of 80 customers, we see that 71 of these customers have lower bills on rate 2, and all 80 of them see lower bills on their rate 3 and rates 4, again, which is very encouraging. In terms of the operating cost gap, like the delta that we want to improve, we find that under the default rate, which is rate 1, operating cost gap is positive for all 80 customers, meaning that there's no payback, right? But when we move these customers to any of these alternative rate designs, all 80 customers switch, to having a negative cost gap. And then that cost gap ranges from $12 to $790 per year based on the customer as well as the rate design. Just very quickly, this is a very important impact on the payback periods for these devices. So if you look at this table, the first columns and under each rate design is the payback without the Inflation Reduction Act incentive. And the second column is the payback with the IRA incentive. We see that the paybacks on the rates 3 and rates 4 are well within the 15-year time frame of many air source heat pumps. But look at the numbers with the IRA incentives. They are very, very reasonable, based on the air source heat pump cost case as well as the incentive, that we can see very immediate paybacks under certain scenarios. Again, very encouraging picture. Just if I could take 2 more minutes for the high-level takeaways. So basically in this analysis, we have shown that rate design is a very powerful tool in addressing the operating cost gap between heat pumps and gas furnaces. With a change in rate structure, we have shown that we were able to flip 80 of all of our 80 sample customers from a positive cost gap to a negative cost gap, which means that these customers can now see meaningful payback periods for their heat pump technologies. You should also note that rate migration can create cost savings and cost or savings independent of feeding electrification, because there are other electricity-based end users in the homes. So this should be taken into account when utilities target customers for rate switching. So there needs to be a good deal of analytics behind the advice that is given to the customers. And last but not least, there are even more opportunities for bill savings when customers fully electrify. In our case, we modeled the partial electrification. The customers still kept their gas connection and paid their gas fixed charges. But in a case where a customer is fully electrified, the potential for the operating cost gap decreases is even higher. And again, the last point here is that just because these rates are available, we cannot expect the customers to know about them and adopt these rates and the technologies. It's equally important to address these information barriers to utility programs as well as training, again, contractors and the like, which could impact customer adoption decision. So
Thanks.
with that, that's the end.
Thank you, Sanem.
Okay, good afternoon. Congratulations to everybody for making it to this point in the day. I'm going to address that niggling voice in the back of probably many of your heads that's saying, gosh, we've been hearing about this stuff for a long time. And some people have tried it and it just never seems to work. And while that's not always necessarily true, there have been success stories. It turns out that there are some big fundamental ecosystem disconnects that underlie that persistent perception of the potential and the value of flexible demand. And those disconnects are addressable, and the costs of not addressing them will be very significant. So I'm going to talk about that. So where is the value and how is it going to come to market? This is from a very recent Pacific Northwest Natural Lab study that was done on a system, modeling a system that is roughly the size and shape of ERCOT, and looking at the potential cost savings from mobilizing flexible demand. And the key takeaway is that the lion's share of the value that's available is in avoided capital investment in uneconomic infrastructure. Those are the 3 red boxes there. Capacity payments, which is a proxy for generation investment, transmission investment, distribution system investment. Very small amount of value comes from providing ancillary services, which is, of course, where a lot of the energy has been focused over recent years. Some more, but still a relatively small amount coming from lowering market clearing energy prices. So as was mentioned by Travis, a number of ways, the bulk of the potential of mobilizing the price elasticity of a lot of electric loads is in avoiding uneconomic infrastructure investment. This is from a very good study from Lawrence Berkeley Labs a couple of years ago of demand response potential in California in 2025. They famously came up with this characterization into of responses into shaping, shifting, shedding, and shimmying. But when broken down by DR service product, or by the service product that flexible demand can provide, what you see in the red is the range of those services that I will either cannot or will not come to market through participation directly in wholesale markets. Instead, and there are a number of reasons for that, and a lot of them have been well documented. Measurement and verification requirements, instrumentation and communications requirements, and just raw complexity of participating in those markets. Instead, most of that value, most of the potential value is going to come to market, if at all, as massively decentralized distributed shifts in system load curves. In other words, not reliant on the discretion of system operators to use or not use it as a generation substitute, but rather as an implicit change in what we think is the firm load curve to which system operators and generators are expected to respond. And if the principal value, and this seems kind of plainly obvious, but if the principal value is in avoiding the cost of uneconomic infrastructure investment, well, you've got to avoid making the uneconomic infrastructure investment in the first place. And yet, there are many ways in which we, often with the best of intentions, back into burdening consumers years into the future with non-bypassable obligations to pay for uneconomic infrastructure. Once you've done that, much of the opportunity from flexible demand is more or less neutralized. So that's the challenge. So if this is where the most of the potential lies and where it's going to find its business case, what would that look like? This is a very hypothetical system. Don't focus on the details so much as the conceptual shapes, and a supply-demand curve. And it's a way that economists, I'm not an economist, but I play one on television. It's a way that economists try to get at what markets are trying to achieve, which is to maximize social welfare. So so this is kind of standard operating procedure in most markets where you've got a supply curve that is largely based on short-run production costs of the marginal resource, largely ignores the demand for reserves in the system and the value of that demand. That's on the supply curve, the orange curve. The black, nearly vertical curve represents the default assumption in most markets for the price responsiveness of demand, which is almost non-existent. The assumption in most cases is nearly perfectly inelastic demand. And this is relatively standard. This is what you see in most markets. If you correct that and you model demand as being more flexible, more inelastic. In other words, as prices rise, demand will start to, the higher prices go, the more demand is going to respond by reducing, by lowering or shifting or postponing consumption. And if you correct the supply curve to reflect the demand for reserves in the system and the value of that demand, you see a very different market clearing process. The difference in this one dispatch interval from making those two changes to the way one looks at load forecasting and one prices the demand for energy in the energy market is that wedge here, which in economist parlance is avoided excess producer surplus. In other words, you're just avoiding paying producers to produce energy that is actually not worth what it costs consumers to consume it. And in this one dispatch interval, in this hypothetical system, the net improvement in social welfare is nearly $250,000. So, and that is basically the value that is being thrown away by committing in advance to infrastructure that could more economically be replaced by demand being given the opportunity to express its own desire or its own firmness of load at any given moment. So this looks at how in many markets the price that is available to much of the demand response potential that we've talked about, that there's price discrimination that those potential resources face. If you look at the implied value of reserves in forward capacity markets or in integrated resource plans for vertically integrated cost of service utility planning models, the value of reserves, of planning reserves, tends to be at least $15,000 to $20,000 a megawatt hour, and in actuality, much higher than that. And yet, in energy markets, where there is some attempt to price the demand in real time for reserves, the prices are capped at much lower levels. Even in the best of cases, in this case, ERCOT, which at one time, this is now out of date, up until January of this year, ERCOT would price up to $9,000 a megawatt hour for not having enough reserves to meet real-time demand for reserves. That's 9,000 is much better than 3,000 or 2,000, which you see in the other ISO markets, but it's obviously far below the value that's attributed to reserves in those out-of-market mechanisms like forward capacity mechanisms or integrated resource plans for regulated utilities, far below the value that resources that are able to and willing to participate in those markets receive for investing forward in planning reserves. So this is just basically raw price discrimination that places much of the potential for demand response at a very significant competitive disadvantage. And through this and through other mechanisms that I get into in the paper, what you see is, and this is just, sorry to pick on PJM, but this is PJM. What you see is a persistent trend among system operators, both regulated and reorganized markets, a persistent trend in significantly over procuring forward capacity, and not just, and in this case, generation capacity. What that does is, in addition to price discrimination, creates market preemption. So long before anyone has the opportunity to more cost effectively balance supply and demand in the system, you've actually committed to and paid outside the market for a much more expensive resource that you're now stuck with for 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And again, through these various mechanisms, that often ends up being a non-bypassable obligation on the part of consumers. So these are ways, big, fundamental, structural ways, disconnects that end up meaning that the success or lack thereof of attempts to mobilize the main source of value from flexible demand basically gets left on the table. So what the paper makes 7 specific recommendations as to what we should do about this. At the retail level, we need to come up with safe options for regulators and consumer advocates to get comfortable with the adoption of extremely dynamic, or let's be blunt about it, real-time pricing tariff options can be adopted. There's a very interesting proposal from the CPUC staff on the table right now called CalFuse that offers a form of subscription that actually provides bill protection while at the same time creating the opportunity for consumers or their service providers to trade around it. Dynamic congestion-based distribution prices for flexible loads so that grid edge responses can be organized in an efficient fashion in response to the signals that are coming from the bulk system. Travis spoke about this as well, dynamic transmission charges for flexible consumers that enable bill savings for avoiding periods of system stress, not 4 times a year, but perhaps as much as 365 days a year, but certainly spread over a much more democratized and much more universal And finally, very important, open access to distribution level load management by third-party providers. The needs for innovation in the space and the need for rapid advances in service innovations is just too great to have it all come through the narrow funnel of a regulated retail service provider. At the wholesale level, pretty obvious, enhanced scarcity pricing so that real-time demand for reserves is priced and valued on the same basis as demand for reserves is priced in capacity markets. Limit capacity market interventions, which are basically subsidies for supply-side solutions in capacity markets to one-year rolling commitments. We've seen in PJM the great success of a program that does just that, too much success. And at the whole system level, all of this needs to manifest itself in progressive assessments and internalizations of the expected elasticity of demand and internalizing that into capacity planning, procurement, and load forecasting processes at both the bulk and the distribution system levels. So that's a quick run through.